Hi everybody, thank you so much for coming today. Thank you, what the fuck is SRE, for having me. I'm super excited to be here and to talk with you about how you can validate your config files in the GitOps world from code to deployment today. But before we begin, I believe that this is the first time that we meet. So hello, my name is Noaa Barki. I am a developer advocate at The Tree. I've been a full stack developer for 7 years. I'm also a tech writer and one of the leaders of GitHub Israel community, which is the largest GitHub community in the whole universe. And I work at an amazing company called The Tree, where we help developers and DevOps engineers to prevent misconfigurations, Kubernetes misconfigurations, from reaching production. Now, my role at The Tree is not only to understand about Kubernetes, how it works, what are the best practices, it's also to understand and learn how you can blow up your own cluster. So partly my job was to learn as much as possible about the common misconfigurations and the pitfalls in the Kubernetes ecosystem. And what I did was to learn from and to read more than 100 Kubernetes postmortems and other companies' failure stories. And not only that, I learned so much about Kubernetes, how it works, and I learned a lot about GitOps. I also learned that when it comes to GitOps and Kubernetes, the most challenging task is to continuously integrate and enforce Kubernetes best practices. And the reason why, in my opinion, is because when it comes to Kubernetes, it involves a lot of different persona, almost like everybody in their R&D department. You have application owners, you have cluster admins, you have security stakeholders, you have a lot of different people, which means that you have a lot of people that sometimes lack the knowledge about Kubernetes. Now, even without shifting left, as your organization grows, you have more developers, you have more software, you have more infrastructure, and you have more things to worry about, and the less chances that you will avoid and prevent human errors and misconfigurations to be applied to your production. So the ultimate question is, how can you delegate infrastructure's code responsibilities to the development teams and still sleep well at night? How can you make sure that everybody will follow these best practices, and how can you basically delegate the knowledge to everybody in the organizations? And this is exactly what we are going to talk about today. So it turns out that there are 3 types of misconfigurations when it comes to Kubernetes. The first type is called syntax errors. You'd be surprised to know how many companies share their own Kubernetes failure stories due to submitting or applying an invalid YAML file or invalid Kubernetes resource with the incorrect schema. You can check these Lendo postmortems where they submitted invalid cron job configuration. They actually used the correct configuration, however, they placed it incorrectly in the YAML, and which basically took their API server down pretty much immediately. So this is the first type of misconfiguration. The second type of the misconfigurations is what I like to call knowledge issues, for all the kinds of mistakes that happen because we didn't follow the best practices in the Kubernetes industry. It often happens in Kubernetes because as I said before, we have a lot of different personas working on Kubernetes, and most of them don't have the knowledge like the DevOps teams usually. For me, actually, the best practice that I first learned when I started to use Kubernetes was to pin my Docker images versions, because every time that I deployed a container, I used a different kind of a version, and trust me, this is not a good best practice. The last category of misconfiguration is team alignment, because it's not only about following the industry best practices, but it's also to be aligned with your teammates and with your organization's best practices. It's sort of like following the internal best practices in your organization. It can be using a specific private registry for your Docker images. It can be using a specific amount limit for your containers. It can be a lot of best practices that are pretty much defined from the requirements of your workloads in your organizations. But these are basically the types of the misconfigurations that we want to prevent. So let's check them one by one to see how we can validate our config files from these misconfigurations, and starting with the syntax errors. So first of all, we want to validate our syntax errors. We want to do it by verifying that the file and that the Kubernetes resources schema that we use are actually correct. So first of all, we want to verify the file format. Whether it is JSON, XML, YAML, Dockerfile, whatever that you use, you need to make sure that the file format that you wrote is actually valid. And there are many ways to use to test that and to validate that. One of my colleagues actually recommended me about the YQ, which is an open source, it's a portable CLI YAML processor, and I highly encourage everybody to use it. It's a wonderful tool. I use it all the time. But once we verified the file format and that we made sure that our file is actually correct, we need to also make sure that what is written in the file is correct also. So we want to verify that the resource syntax is correct, and especially when it comes to Kubernetes, we want to make sure that the schema that we wrote is correct. Now, there are many ways to do it. The built-in way is to use the kubectl CLI, and specifically with the dry run flag, which specify for the kubectl to not create or to apply this resource. It's basically only perform the validation in the cluster, and that's it. There's a small issue with using kubectl it's that it won't work when you don't have any internet connection. And in this way, the other way to validate your resources that I use is to use the kubeconfirm, which is an open source project. It allows you to validate your resources. It basically pulls all the Kubernetes schemas every once in a while and allows you to validate your resources even when you're offline. I really love it. I use it all the time. It's great. Another way to do it, if you're like one of the developers that prefer the in-house solution, is to use the JSON schema store, which basically a hub that people can upload all kind of schema validators for all kinds of technologies. And together with schema, a JSON schema package, you can validate every configuration file that you have. So it's pretty powerful. And that's it. This is basically all about the validate syntax error. So let's move forward to how we can validate our resources, our config files, to follow best practices. So when it comes to preventing misconfigurations that happen due to knowledge gaps, we basically want to overcome our knowledge gaps by learning the industry best practices. And to be honest, my fair advice to you, my top tool, the best tool that I recommend is to read about other companies and to learn from other companies' failure stories. I personally did it, and you know the old saying, the difference between a smart person and a clever person is that a clever person not only learns from his own mistakes, but he also learns from the mistakes of others. So I highly recommend you to go and look for other companies' failure stories. Not only that you will learn so much about Kubernetes, what are the best practices, what to do, what not to do, you will also ask yourself, it will ultimately ask yourself the question of how can I make sure that it will never happen to me? And this question is very important because it forces you to think about what are the requirements of your workloads and what is the security and the stability that you want to have for your production, and how can you achieve that? So it's very powerful. Some of the lessons that I've learned was to always make sure that I set the CPU memory and the CPU and the memory limit for my containers. I learned it from the Blue Matador story. They forgot to add the memory limit in one of their pods, and these pods actually hosted Sumo Logic containers that were memory hogs, and since they forgot to add a memory limit, nothing stopped from those pods to take up all the memory in the cluster, which obviously took their cluster down. And I told you this story about Target, that they use the concurrency policy with allow. In the best practice, recommend to set it to either forbid or to replace. There are many lessons that I've learned from learning about other companies, so I highly recommend you to go and read. I'm talking about a lot of companies. You have Google, Spotify, Airbnb, Datadog, Zalando, Target, Toyota, Tesla, a lot of companies. There are security issues and misconfigurations, deprecation and cost reduction. There are many types of misconfigurations that you can learn from. Now, Kubernetes is one thing, and I know that every technology has its own tools and best practices, and this is why I want to highly recommend you this repository. It's called Static Analysis. It's an open source, of course, and this repository basically curated tools for all kinds of technologies. I really like it. I'm sure that you will find it very helpful too. So, last but not least, let's talk about how you can enforce those best practices in order to make sure that you prevent the misconfigurations that happens due to organizations and team alignment. So when it comes to organizational or team alignment, we basically want to ensure that everybody in the organization follow these best practices. So it's pretty much a question of policy enforcement. So the first question that you should ask yourself is, where in the pipeline I want to enforce my policies and my best practices? Do I want to enforce it in the CI pipeline? Then it will affect mostly the developers teams in my organization, or maybe I want to enforce it in the CI or directly in the cluster. I don't know. But this is an important question, because the place that you will choose to enforce your best practices might affect your entire organization. But once you decide that you want to enforce those best practices, first of all, you need to define the policies and the rules that you want to enforce in your organization. I'm not talking about only best practices in the industry. I'm talking about the policies that are internal best practices in your organizations. And policies, they're not just do's and don'ts. They define how you work in your team, how you work in your organization. It can be for checking that every cron job has configured the deadline. It can be to make sure that every container has configured liveness or readiness probe. It can be to make sure that you use a private registry, as I said before. It can be whatever you want. But once you have a set of policies that you want to enforce, the real question is, how will you distribute those policies in your CI/CD pipelines? And there are many tools that you can use. One of the tools that you can use is actually OPA Conftest, which is an open source. It's very nice. I really love Conftest. It allows you to write unit tests for, I'm sorry, I'll just move myself. Okay, it allows you to write tests for any structured file, and I'm talking about Docker, YAML, XML, JSON, any structured file with OPA as a policy engine under the hood. Another tool that you can use is my very own The Tree open source project, which is much like Conftest, allows you to scan all your Kubernetes resources, but also it already comes with built-in policies and rules for Kubernetes and Argo CD. Now, a question that usually being asked is, how can I manage all these policies when I have many GitOps repositories? And this is good question, and the answer is centralized policy management solution. So to build centralized policy management solution, first of all, you need to make sure that you have an easy way to dynamically adjust your policies. I'm talking about a place, an intuitive environment that you can implement and modify your policies at scale with your organization at scale and according to your organization's need. Now, Git is wonderful, but for version control, not for management. Git won't provide you anything that you will need, because you also need a way to control, review, and monitor your policies. For instance, you need a way to control over who can create or delete the policies. You need a place to control over what policies are actually being used in practice in my organization, in my teams. you need to make sure that you have the observability and the visibility over the improvement and the progress in your organization. Because the thing about policies when it comes to Kubernetes is that they are sort of like a contract between everybody that works on Kubernetes. And as we talked before, it's a lot of different personas. You have the developers, you have the security people, and you have the DevOps engineers. It's a lot of different personas. So to make sure that your policies are actually effective, you also need to make sure that they are being communicated properly. You can send emails, you can, be creative according to your organizational needs, but it's really important to provide guidelines to make sure that people actually know what to do when one of these policies gets failed. And that's it, guys. Thank you so much for being with me. I really hope that this session inspired you to start thinking about what are the policies in your organization and how you will enforce those policies starting today. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.